Greetings, class. My name is Brad Dush, and I'm going to share with you 6 keys to increasing productivity. 6 keys to increasing productivity. First thing we have to do is ask ourselves, what is productivity? A lot of times we think it is just getting things done better and quicker, maybe being more efficient. Well, Chris Bailey from Emeritus Insight says most people think of productivity as an increase in efficiency. In today's world, it actually translates into how much you can accomplish by the end of the day, week, or year. At the center of these productivity gains is managing your time, attention, and energy. And so when we think about it from that perspective, it's really not as much about getting things produced and turned out as much as being managers of what's happening, our time, attention, and energy. So where does this productivity begin? Well, I'm going to think and say that it begins with leadership or management. BDC consultant Diane Bazier says if you do a good job, your employees are more likely to be loyal partners in helping you build a thriving company with growing profits. So managers need to be leaders leading the way as opposed to just telling people what to do. Sometimes I like to call it getting into the trenches. So who's responsible then? We said leaders need to do that, right? Managers need to do that. But here's the reality. The leader leads by example, but it's still a team effort. You can't have just a great leader or a great crew. You need great teamwork between everyone involved, the employees and the management. That's how you get productivity to increase. So let's take a look now at those um, the 6 keys to managing productivity gains. The first one is for us to understand that productivity, it's a long game. It's not a short game. Nothing is going to happen overnight. There's no magic that you can create to just make your team go from zero to hero, if you will. There's a great book out there called Growing Great Employees by Erica Anderson. I highly recommend the book. She has this way that she talks about gardening and the garden as a picture for growing a great team. That's why it says growing great employees. And so she has this theme that works through this book, and we're going to kind of see that here a little bit as we refer to it. But if you think about it, nothing that you plant in a garden just pops up overnight, right? It takes time. So the very first key is for us to understand productivity gains happen because of a long game. It's not a short game, it's a long game. The second key, if we keep with that kind of an idea of the gardening theme that Anderson introduces, is you have to have a plan, right? You have to have a plan. I don't know how many of you have ever planted flowers, but it's interesting. When you start planting flowers and plants in a garden, there's instructions with them that tell you how close you can put them together, whether or not they need lots of sunlight or very little sunlight. And so as you work through all those little intricacies, you have to have a plan. You just can't plant anything next to each other and they grow. And Erica talks a little bit about that in her book. And then if you've ever read it, it's an old book, an older book, but it's a great book by Stephen R. Covey, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. He's got a quote in there where he says to begin with the end in mind means to start with a clear understanding of your destination. It means to know where you're going so that you better understand where you are now and so that the steps you take are always in the right direction. So the key is have a plan, right? Have a plan in mind. And that's why he says begin with an end in mind. The third key is measuring impact. Right? It's measuring impact with the plan and goals in mind. A couple of quotes that I thought were pretty good from Diane Bazier again. She says, positive feedback strengthens employee engagement. You and your manager should give meaningful feedback through the year, not just at year-end performance reviews. I've worked for companies that only gave year-end reviews, and I've worked for companies that have given reviews throughout the year. And I will tell you, firsthand, productivity is always better and has more of a chance of increasing when you kind of measure impact along with the plan. So you got to have that plan, but you have to measure how you're doing with that plan and with the goals in mind. Erica, in her book, she says also at this point, speaking in reference to somebody that you might have to terminate, at this point, keeping the person on is bad for the company, bad for the team, bad for you, and even I would argue ultimately bad for the person. It's one of the things that measuring impact with the plan and goals in mind has the opportunity to see how employees are performing, and you might have to have some change in employees to measure that and to have the impact that you need to have the productivity gains. And so that's one of the things that we work at there. Now, the fourth key is a really good reminder, right? It's not a sprint. Sometimes we get caught up in this idea that we've got to get moving and we got to go full blown, full blast all the time. But what we have to understand is it's not a sprint, right? The old tortoise and hare story comes to mind there. But what I think is interesting that Chris Bailey says, and again, Chris is from Emeritus Insights, she says, when evaluating the tasks you have for the day, determine which activities have the highest impact. Just because it shows up in your to-do list or it's in your inbox doesn't mean you should spend time on it today, or even in some cases, spend any time on it. Right? So that fourth key is just because something pops in there, you don't have to quickly shift gears and go to it. Just stay nice and steady and find that pace that works for you and for your team. That's how you manage. Not managing to a sprint, but managing to a distance run. And staying focused, I think, falls into that same category as you're doing that. Now, the fifth key is one that I call gaining through training. There's one of the things that we have to understand. We're always needing to grow in our skill set and to learn new skills. And so training becomes very key then to productivity gains. A couple quotes there that I thought I'd bring up is Erica Anderson. She says, I'm convinced that what we call good teaching is mostly about teaching in a way that aligns with the way people learn. Important to find what works for your team, how people learn. That's how you administer training. And sometimes you got to get creative and be out of the box. That's what Diane Brazier says. She says, explore semi-formal learning such as mentoring, job shadowing, and focused reading. Reinforce training with opportunities for workers to apply their new skills on the job. So gain through training, but you might have to be creative about that, right? You might have to find what works for your team, what doesn't work for your team. And the sixth and final key to productivity gains is communicate, communicate, communicate. And for me, two things come to the top of that list. The first is you have to communicate openly and honestly, right? And you have that figure, that picture on the left there. All those ideas are very different and they're changing as people are open and honest. And those ideas can merge into something, a puzzle that works and fits inside itself. And it can be beautiful. The next part of that is also make sure that you're communicating and you're transparent. It goes a long way when you're transparent. So to kind of wrap up, effective management is what equals productivity gains. Effective management. Remember the me and team. We do need team leaders and managers that are leading the way, right? Getting into those trenches as I referred to earlier. But we also need to remember that with team, together everyone achieves more. Another key there is effective management to equal productivity gains is what I call chunk to skip the funk. You got to take it a step at a time. You got to take off a little bite and a little bite, and those little bites that you take on and work to increase productivity will add up to big gains in the end. It's a step-by-step process. And lastly, effective management to equal productivity gains. Don't be afraid to ask questions. I dare say none of us are experts. We all have something to learn, and that's part of communicating. Is you have to look for advice, tips, assistance, guidance. Help, support. Be a team player, and make sure that you're leading with integrity, and you'll see productivity gains through effective management.